The night the storm hit was unlike anything our town had seen in decades. The wind howled with an almost human voice, whipping rain against windows and tearing branches from trees that had stood for generations. It wasn't just rain, it was sheets of water, falling so heavily that the world beyond a few feet disappeared into a gray blur. Lightning cracked across the sky in jagged patterns, illuminating the darkness for brief, electric moments before plunging everything back into shadow. In those flashes, the world looked different, transformed into something both beautiful and terrifying. The thunder that followed shook the ground beneath my feet, resonating in my chest like a second heartbeat. I remember thinking that nature has a way of reminding us how small we really are, how fragile our carefully constructed lives can be when faced with its raw power. My name is Alex, 26, working at the local library in our small coastal town. I'd stayed late cataloging a new collection of maritime history books, completely losing track of time until the first thunderclaps shook the building. By then, the weather alerts were blowing up my phone, warning of flash floods and high winds. I should have left hours earlier, but now I was facing a 3-mile walk home in what was quickly becoming the storm of the century. The library's ancient roof was already leaking in 3 places, and the lights flickered ominously. I knew I couldn't stay, but stepping outside felt like diving into the ocean during a hurricane. That's when I saw him, huddled under the narrow awning of the building across the street. Even through the downpour, I could tell he was soaked to the skin, his dark hair plastered to his forehead, shoulders hunched against the relentless wind. Something about his posture, a certain vulnerability mixed with determination, made me pause. He looked up just as lightning flashed again, and for a moment, our eyes met across the flooded street. I didn't know then that this stranger would change everything. His name was Noah, 28, new to town and caught completely unprepared by the sudden fury of the storm. He'd been walking back from his job interview at the Marine Research Center, having recently moved here to start fresh after years working on fishing boats up north. The storm had caught him halfway between the center and his temporary rental, which was still another 2 miles away. When I called out to him, offering to share my umbrella for whatever good it might do, he looked surprised, then grateful. "It's going to break any second now," I shouted over the wind, gesturing to my already inverted umbrella. "But I've got a heavy-duty raincoat we could both squeeze under if you're heading east." The rain was pelting us both, making conversation difficult, but I saw relief wash over his face. He nodded, jogging across the street to join me under the library's entrance. "Noah," he said, extending a dripping hand, which I shook despite the absurdity of formalities when we were both already soaked. "And east is exactly where I need to go." "Thank you." His voice was deeper than I expected, with a slight accent I couldn't place, and his smile transformed his face from merely handsome to something that made my heart skip. As we set out together, sharing my raincoat held over our heads like a makeshift tent, the storm intensified. The wind pushed against us with such force that several times we nearly lost our footing. Streets were beginning to flood, water rushing down hills and pooling at intersections. Debris flew through the air, plastic bags, loose shingles, even someone's garden gnome skidded past us at one point, making us both laugh despite the danger. I've been through nor'easters, hurricanes off the Atlantic, even a small typhoon once, Noah shouted as we pressed forward, shoulders touching under the inadequate shelter of my coat. But something about this feels different, more personal somehow. I knew exactly what he meant. There was an intensity to this storm that felt almost deliberate, as if it had been waiting for precisely this moment to unleash its fury. We'd made it about half a mile when disaster struck. A massive gust caught us broadside, ripping the raincoat from our grasp and sending it cartwheeling down the street and into the darkness. We watched it disappear, then looked at each other, rain streaming down our faces. "Now what?" I asked, having to lean close to his ear to be heard over the storm's roar. Noah scanned our surroundings, then pointed to a structure about 100 yards ahead. "That boathouse. It should be unlocked. They never lock it during storm season in case someone needs emergency shelter from the water." The boathouse was indeed unlocked, and we stumbled inside, dripping and breathless. It was dark except for the occasional flash of lightning through the high windows, but it was dry and solid, the wooden walls creaking but standing firm against the wind. The smell of salt water, old rope, and varnish filled the air. Several small rowboats and kayaks were stored on racks along the walls, and fishing equipment hung from hooks in neat rows. "You know this place?" I asked, wringing water from my shirt. Noah nodded, running a hand through his wet hair. "I worked in places like this up and down the coast. They're all pretty similar." He moved confidently through the darkness to a cabinet near the back wall. "And they all keep emergency supplies." He opened the cabinet door with a flourish, revealing flashlights, first aid kits, and several vacuum-sealed packages, including emergency blankets. The blanket, when he unwrapped it, was larger than I expected, a thick, wool-blend affair rather than one of those thin silver emergency sheets. It was navy blue with white stripes along the edges, clearly designed for practical use rather than comfort, but in that moment it looked more inviting than the finest cashmere. "One blanket," I observed, stating the obvious as we both stood there dripping. "One blanket," Noah agreed, a slight smile playing at the corners of his mouth. "But it's big enough to share, if you don't mind the company." There was something in his voice, not presumption, but a gentle question, leaving room for me to refuse if I wanted to. "I think we're past standing on ceremony," I said, trying to keep my tone light despite the strange flutter in my stomach. "Besides, we're both soaked, and it's getting colder. Sharing body heat is just practical." We settled on the wooden floor, backs against the wall, the blanket wrapped around our shoulders. Our wet clothes made it less than ideal, but the alternative was hypothermia, so we huddled close, thighs and shoulders pressed together out of necessity. Outside, the storm continued its assault, rain hammering against the roof and walls like thousands of impatient fingers. "So," Noah said after a few minutes of slightly awkward silence, "a librarian, huh? Do you fit the stereotype? Shushing people and having a secret wild side?" His tone was teasing, and I could feel some of the tension between us dissipating. I laughed. "Hardly. Though I did once chase a teenager through the stacks for eating pizza near the first editions. And my wild side extends to occasionally shelving fiction in the wrong order just to see if anyone notices." "Rebel," he said, nudging my shoulder with his. "What about you? What's a fisherman doing applying at the Marine Research Center? Career change?" Noah was quiet for a moment, and I worried I'd touched on something sensitive. When he spoke, his voice had lost some of its lightness. "My father and grandfather were both fishermen. I grew up on boats, learned to tie knots before I could write my name. But the industry is dying. The catches get smaller every year, the regulations tighter, the big commercial operations pushing out the small boats." He sighed, and I could feel the rise and fall of his chest beside me. I watched what it did to my father, the stress, the uncertainty. He died of a heart attack at 52. "I'm sorry," I said softly. "I loved the water, but I didn't want that life. So I went back to school, got a degree in marine biology. Figured I could help understand what's happening to the oceans, maybe find solutions." He smiled ruefully. "Plus, research vessels generally don't go out in weather like this." As we talked, the storm seemed to intensify even further. The boathouse creaked and groaned around us, and water began to seep under the door, forming a slowly expanding puddle on the wooden floor. We pulled our feet up, shifting closer together as our safe space gradually shrank. "Should we be worried?" I asked, eyeing the water. Noah shook his head. "The boathouse is built on pilings. Even if the area floods, we'll stay above water level. We just might become temporarily island-bound." I wasn't entirely reassured, but his confidence helped. "So we're stuck here until the storm passes?" "Looks that way." He turned to face me more directly, and in the dim light filtering through the windows, I could see his eyes searching mine. "Is that okay? Being stuck here with a stranger?" "You don't feel like a stranger," I said before I could think better of it. And it was true. There was something about Noah that felt familiar, comfortable, despite having just met. Perhaps it was the crisis bringing us together, or perhaps something more. "I know what you mean," he said quietly. "It's strange, isn't it? How sometimes you can know someone for years and never really connect, and other times." He trailed off, but his eyes held mine. "And other times you meet someone once and feel like you've known them forever," I finished. The blanket had slipped slightly, and as he reached to adjust it, his hand brushed against mine. Neither of us moved to break the contact. Outside, lightning flashed again, illuminating his face in stark relief, the strong line of his jaw, the curve of his lips, the intensity in his eyes as they held mine. "I should tell you something," he said, his voice lower now. "In the interest of honesty, I noticed you before tonight." "What do you mean?" "At the library. Last week. I came in to use the reference materials on local marine ecosystems. You were helping an elderly woman find something in the large print section. You were so patient with her, and you had this smile." He looked slightly embarrassed now. I wanted to introduce myself, but I lost my nerve. I felt a rush of warmth that had nothing to do with the blanket. "Why didn't you?" He shrugged, a small movement I felt rather than saw. "I'm not usually good at this. Meeting people, making connections. Out on the water for weeks at a time, you get used to solitude. Sometimes I think I've forgotten how to be around others." You're doing fine so far, I said, surprised by my own boldness. The storm chose that moment to assert itself again, a thunderclap so loud and close that we both jumped, instinctively moving closer together. When the echo faded, neither of us moved back to our original positions. The blanket was wrapped tightly around us now, creating a cocoon of warmth in the increasingly cold boathouse. Tell me something about yourself, Noah said. Something you wouldn't normally tell someone you just met. I thought for a moment. I came back to this town to take care of my mother after she was diagnosed with early-onset Alzheimer's. She passed away last year, but I stayed. Everyone expected me to leave. I had a job offer at a university library in Boston, but I couldn't. This place has a hold on me that I can't explain. I understand that. Some places just get into your blood. He shifted slightly, his arm now pressed fully against mine. Is that why you were at the library so late? Because there's nothing pulling you home. The question was perceptive, cutting closer to the truth than I was comfortable admitting. Partly, I acknowledged. The library's always been my safe place. Books don't expect anything from you. They're just there, waiting to share their stories whenever you're ready to listen. Like the ocean, Noah said. It doesn't care who you are or what you've done. It's just there, constant but always changing. We fell into a comfortable silence, listening to the rain and the creaking of the boathouse. I was acutely aware of every point where our bodies touched, shoulder to shoulder, hip to hip, and now, as we settled in for what looked to be a long night, my head tentatively resting against his shoulder. Is this okay? I asked, feeling suddenly uncertain. In response, Noah shifted his arm, wrapping it around my shoulders and drawing me closer. More than okay, he murmured, his breath warm against my hair. The storm continued to rage outside, but inside our makeshift shelter, something else was building, a different kind of tension, electric and warm. We talked for hours, sharing stories that seemed to flow more easily in the darkness, with the storm as our backdrop. I told him about my childhood dreams of becoming a writer, about the novel I'd been working on in secret for years. He told me about the most beautiful sunrise he'd ever seen, from the deck of a fishing boat miles from shore, where the water and sky became indistinguishable. As the night wore on, our conversations deepened. Noah spoke about his fear that he was betraying his family's legacy by leaving fishing behind. I confessed my guilt over feeling relieved when my mother finally passed, ending her suffering but leaving me with complicated grief. The hardest part, I said, my voice barely audible over the storm, is that I don't know if she knew how much I loved her, at the end. If she remembered me at all. Noah's hand found mine under the blanket, his fingers intertwining with mine. She knew, he said with quiet certainty. Some things go deeper than memory. There was a moment then, one of those moments that seemed to exist outside of normal time, where everything stilled. The storm, the cold, the uncertainty of the future, all faded into background noise. What remained was just us, two people finding unexpected connection in the middle of chaos. I'm not sure who moved first. Perhaps we both did, drawn together like the tide pulled by the moon. His lips were surprisingly soft against mine, the kiss tentative at first, a question more than a statement. When I responded, leaning into him, the kiss deepened, becoming something more urgent, more honest. His hand came up to cup my face, thumb tracing my cheekbone with a gentleness that made my heart ache. When we finally pulled apart, both slightly breathless, the look in his eyes reflected what I was feeling, surprise, wonder, and a strange sense of recognition, as if we'd found something we hadn't known we were looking for. I don't usually kiss strangers in boathouses during storms, I said, attempting humor to mask how deeply affected I was. Noah smiled, tucking a strand of my now dry hair behind my ear. I don't think we're strangers anymore, Alex. The way he said my name, like it was something precious, something he wanted to keep saying, sent a shiver through me that had nothing to do with the cold. We kissed again, and again, the blanket now wrapped around us like a cocoon, protecting us from the world outside. There was an innocence to it, despite the growing heat between us, a sense of discovering something new and fragile that we both wanted to nurture rather than rush. Eventually, exhaustion began to overtake us. The adrenaline of the storm and the emotional intensity of our connection gave way to heavy eyelids and slowing conversation. We arranged ourselves as comfortably as possible on the hard-wooden floor, still wrapped in the blanket, my head on his chest, his arm around me. What happens when the storm ends? I asked, voicing the question that had been hovering at the edges of my mind. Noah was quiet for a moment, his fingers gently combing through my hair. I don't know, he admitted, but I'd like to find out. If you would. I nodded against his chest, listening to the steady beat of his heart. I would. As we drifted towards sleep, The storm began to abate, the spaces between thunderclaps growing longer, the rain softening from violent assault to gentle percussion. I remember thinking, as consciousness slipped away, that sometimes the most unexpected shelters turn out to be the ones we need most. Morning came with gentle persistence, sunlight streaming through the high windows of the boathouse, painting stripes of gold across the floor. The storm had passed, leaving behind a world washed clean, the air fresh with the scent of rain and salt. We awoke still entwined, momentarily disoriented before memory returned. "Hi," Noah said, his voice rough with sleep, a smile spreading across his face as he looked at me. "Hi," I replied, suddenly shy in the revealing light of day. We emerged from the boathouse to find a transformed landscape. The harbor was strewn with debris, branches, litter, even a small dinghy that had broken free from its mooring and now sat incongruously in the middle of the parking lot. But the sky was a perfect, washed blue, and a rainbow arched over the water, its colors vivid against the retreating storm clouds. "It's beautiful," I said, standing at the edge of the dock, surveying the damage and renewal. Noah came to stand beside me, his hand finding mine naturally, as if we'd been doing this for years rather than hours. "Worth weathering the storm for," he agreed, and I knew he wasn't just talking about the rainbow. We folded the blanket carefully, returning it to its cabinet for the next person who might need its shelter. As we did, our hands worked in tandem, corners meeting in the middle, a simple domestic act that somehow felt significant. "I think I'm going to get that job at the research center," Noah said as we prepared to leave the boathouse. They seemed impressed with my practical experience. "I hope you do," I said. "It would be nice to have you stay in town." "Even if I don't," he said, turning to face me fully, "I'm not going far. Not now." We walked back toward town together, picking our way around puddles and fallen branches. The world felt new, possibilities stretching before us like the clear sky above. I didn't know what would happen next, whether this connection forged in crisis would withstand the return to normal life, but for the first time in a long time, I was eager to find out. "You know," Noah said as we reached the point where our paths would diverge, "I still have that interview suit hanging in my bathroom. It probably needs to be properly dried out." "I have a dryer," I offered, the invitation clear in my voice. His smile was like the sun breaking through clouds. "I was hoping you'd say that." As we turned toward my apartment, I couldn't help but think about the blanket we'd left behind in the boathouse. One blanket, barely adequate but somehow enough when shared. Perhaps that was the lesson of the storm, that sometimes what seems insufficient alone becomes exactly what we need when combined with someone else's warmth. The storm had passed, but something new had been born in its fury, a connection, a possibility, a beginning. And as Noah's hand held mine, steady and sure, I knew that whatever weather came next, we would face it together, finding shelter in each other when the next storm hit. In the weeks and months that followed, our relationship grew like something planted in rich soil after a cleansing rain. Noah did get the job at the Marine Research Center, and I watched with pride as he threw himself into the work of understanding and protecting the waters that had shaped him. I finally showed someone my novel, him, and with his encouragement, began to send it to publishers. We still have that night of the storm as our origin story, the moment that brought two strangers together under one blanket. Sometimes, when rain lashes against the windows of the apartment we now share, we wrap ourselves in a navy blue blanket with white stripes along the edges, not the same one, but similar enough to remind us and tell each other stories. Building new shelters against whatever storms might come. And they do come, as storms always will. Life brings its own tempests, disappointments, arguments, fears, losses. But we face them together now, having learned that first night that sometimes the most unexpected shelter is the one we find in each other's arms. The blanket we shared that night remains in the boathouse by the harbor, ready to offer its protection to the next person caught in a storm. I like to think of it sometimes, waiting there patiently, holding within its fibers the memory of two people who found each other when they needed shelter most. Perhaps that's what love is, in the end, not a grand passion that burns like lightning, but a steady warmth that persists through the storm. A simple blanket, inadequate alone but perfect when shared. A shelter built of nothing more complicated than two people choosing, again and again, to face the weather together. Total_char_count, 26,815.